So this particular environment is probably well known to most of us because this is where we spend most of our days if we are on holiday or we are just relaxing along the beach. This is the area that we want to spend more time in. So the sandy beaches. And then just at first glance, it does look like there's nothing happening here. It's a little bit more dry, not much organisms at all in this environment. Definitely not seaweeds, no seaweed in this environment as well. But in fact, there are some organisms within this area as well. And that's what we're going to look at in a little bit more detail. So again, at first glance, it doesn't seem to appear that there are that many, if any, organism finding or living in this environment. But as I was pointing out in this video, there were those holes, and those are indications that there are animals hiding underneath the sand. And then if we're lucky, we get to see some other organisms as well, as indicated here. And we'll point out a few of them as we go along. So while there are no plants actually growing in this environment, and by plants, I'm referring to seaweed here, a lot of the organic matter is actually transported from the ocean into this environment. So the source of their food is from the ocean. So even the seaweed, the kelp that we looked at earlier in terms of the rocky shore, in the subtidal area, they wash up on the beach after a big storm, and they provide food for a variety of other organisms here. So as we did with the rocky shore, we were looking at the abiotic factors. So what did you think are the most abiotic factors? What are the challenges that animals would face in this environment? And why are there no seaweeds here?
There's no rocky substrate for them to attach to.
Definitely no rocky substrate for them to attach to. Anything else?
As well as the wave action,
Wave
and
action.
limited food coming in.
Okay, so wave action, as in the case with the rocky shore, the same kind of stresses that we had in the rocky shore. So desiccation would also apply here. The fact in this instance, there's also a little bit of competition for food, not so much space, but also, as you were saying, there's limited food. They're reliant on the food that washes up on the beach after a storm. And so that doesn't happen too often. And so that means that some of those organisms that reside in this area are going to have to be able to deal with less food coming into this environment. So besides that, so that's more in terms of competition and food and predation, etc. But what are the waves doing? Remember, this is a sandy environment. So what are the waves doing?
The waves are knocking up sediment.
Yep, it's knocking up the sediment. It's transferring that sediment up the coastline. Yeah. And in the case of some of the bigger pieces of sediment, it's going to be eroding them and breaking them up even further. And then once washed up onto the beach itself, if it dries out, that sediment is then moved even further by the wind action. So it's not just wave action that is going to be a challenge in terms of this environment, but also wind action moving the sediment. as well as being exposed at a spring low tide, which means that organisms within those environments are going to be out of water. And so how do they deal with those kind of stresses? There's also not that much space for them to hide. So where do they hide? What do they do in order to deal with this constant wave action that is moving up and down the coastline?
Uh, they would burrow a bit beneath the sediment to seek shelter.
Well, that's one way of doing it. So definitely there are some organisms that burrow beneath the sediment. There are some that do something else entirely differently. Okay. So the sediment is also one of the factors that are going to influence the kind of organisms that you're going to find in your sandy beach. So, and here we're looking at the size and the frequency of the waves that can either break down the beach, so erode it, or build it up, so extend and deposit a little bit more sediment in those areas. And so it's relating to how strong the wave action is in a particular area. So this is one of the beaches here in Cape Town, close to Muli Point. And here you can see the size of the particles are quite big here. And that's due to big, strong wave action in this environment. The slope is rather steep. Slope is very, very steep. And the area of beach is actually very narrow. So this is not necessarily an area that you're going to want to suntan along. Because one, the kind of sediment is rather big and rough. And secondly, a very small area, stretch of beach in this particular area. So the wave action, they drive those finer particles further up the shore. And so high up on the shore, you'll see smaller, finer particles, and the more coarse sand and particles will be at the lower levels of those exposed beach. So here we have these coarse sediments, and can you see what it's made up of?
They're mostly made out of shells and other rocks.
Yeah, definitely. So pieces of shells and other rocks. So organisms that have died, and those have now broken up and eroded. And so those particles are quite big. This is under the microscope, or was under the microscope, photograph taken, but it is rather big in relation to actual sand. So coarse sand, because of the size of the particles that form the sediment, the water drains very quickly through the sediment. And so water drains very quickly, which means that if there are any organisms living in the sand that requires water or to be in an aquatic environment, they are going to have less water in which to live, less oxygen, and so potentially could dry out as well. So water drains very quickly through the system. Water, because it drains very quickly, it's not stagnant, so it doesn't stay in one area and becomes a bit rotten. And so, as mentioned earlier on, dries out quickly during low tide. So while it doesn't retain a lot of water, it does have a lot of oxygen between the particles. So perhaps for animals that are a bit more air breathing, this might be a bit of a consideration. And as the water drains through the sand very quickly, it doesn't allow for water to be drawn up from the water table into this environment. So it has a very low water table in this environment. As opposed to this environment. Okay, a much wider stretch of beach. Okay, so the waves are not as strong as what we saw in the previous environment, so it's a little bit more calmer. And so this results in a little bit more sediment being deposited, and the beach tends to be very broad and not as steep as what we saw in the case of where there's lots of high wave action. Okay, so the kind of sediment that you're going to find here is very fine sand. And so because of the size of the sediment, water drains very, very slowly through these particles. As a result, it might stop water moving through there, and essentially the water becomes a bit stagnant. And if the organisms use up a lot of oxygen because there's not a lot of air spaces in between, they are eventually, some of them eventually start using sulfur instead. And then we get a case of a rotten egg smell, hydrogen sulfide smell. So very anaerobic kind of conditions. So water drains very slowly through these particles. It retains moisture between the sand grains, so there's less space for air. It also then draws a lot of water from the water table due to capillary action into this environment. So it's always covered with water. And as mentioned earlier on, water could become rather stagnant in this environment. So less oxygen and may become anaerobic. And so bacteria within the sediment would use up, instead of oxygen, would use up sulfur, so release the byproduct of that would be hydrogen sulfide. So if you dig into the sand and get to this black layer, it often smells like rotten eggs. And that's due to the fact that bacteria have essentially used up the oxygen and is now instead using sulfur. So as mentioned earlier on, there's not that much actually visible living organisms in this environment, but we do see lots of, particularly along the west coast and the south coast, we find lots of kelp washing up, and along with that, some other organisms as well. So there is a practice at some beaches where they remove the kelp and the seaweed from the beaches. But in fact, they actually provide a surface in this environment. So while they are usually found in your kelp forest ecosystem and your subtidal environment, even when they wash up on the beach, they still form part of the sandy shore ecosystem, and in providing support for other organisms to grow and extend, but also for other animals to actually feed on, and we'll point out that in a bit. So where these, in some of our beaches, we've left the kelp there, so they've just kind of been piled into a particular area, and that helps in terms of as the wind blows the sand and the sediment across this area, some of that sand gets trapped in and amongst the kelp. So the kelp forms a bit of a barrier, and that eventually starts growing further and starts creating a little bit of a pile. In addition to that, as the kelp rots and gets decomposed, that releases a lot of nutrients into the sand, which is really important for some of your terrestrial plants to grow in that environment. So not only is the sand trapped, so it prevents a bit of erosion occurring, and then secondly, providing a bit of nutrients into that environment, as well as a area where you'll start seeing sort of pioneer plants settling in this environment. So this would be the start of a dune system extending beyond that. So some of the dune plants that we find along our beaches, and so this is typically of what we find here along the south and the west coast, and I think one or two might extend in along the east coast. So you'll see that it's a large area that's covered with vegetation. So these plants are they terrestrial plants, but they experience quite a bit of sea spray. So they needing to be able to retain their moisture so that they don't dry out from this very dry, arid environment with a bit of sea spray and maybe some rainfall in that environment. So they've got various ways in order to ensure that they don't lose a lot of moisture. What we also see here as possibly being different plants are in fact one plant. So if I were to start pulling them up, we'll start seeing that actually they are part of another system. So they've got this running root system, and it doesn't penetrate too deep into the sand. And that's partially because when it does rain, the water drains through there rather quickly. So if it's close to the surface and over the entire area, they are able to trap a bit of moisture. So just kind of reinforcing that they've got the spreading root system. And that obviously does help in terms of reducing erosion and also stopping the sand from spreading. So importantly, starting these dune systems. One of the specific plants that we find here are the salvic plants. So the leaves are succulent, and they're covered with a thick layer. So it does prevent a lot of moisture from being lost through the leaves, so transpiration. Also note that the leaves are facing upwards, and so that means only a small part of the leaf is actually exposed when it is at the peak of sunlight. So that also does help in terms of reducing the amount of water that's lost through those systems. Okay, so looking at the sandy shore intertidal zone. So now we're looking at, so that was high up, so in basically your supertidal area and the start of your dune system. And then we're looking at the intertidal zone, so area that will be covered at a spring high tide, so that's the maximum the tide will go to, and area that is exposed at a spring low tide. And then within this area, we can generally divide them up into 3 areas. So your upper shore, your high shore, your middle shore, and your lower shore. So in context, on a photograph, where would that sit? So high up on the shore, it's a little bit beyond that to the left, I would say. So high shore, your supralittoral zone. Sort of where the waves are slowly coming, that would be your mid shore or your mid littoral zone. And then far beyond that would be your low shore or your sublittoral zone, and that would only be really exposed at a spring low tide. So what are the stresses or the challenges for animals in your high shore, your supralittoral zone? So looking at these images, okay, other than the seaweed that washes up on the beach, it is rather dry. And so these animals that are found here are going to have to deal with not that much food availability to begin with, and then also being out of the water for quite a bit of time. There are obviously a bit of other challenges. So we've got also within this environment, your gulls entering here and looking out for animals within this environment, and they will pick that up and feed on those. So there is definitely some predation in this environment as well. Okay, so where are the animals hiding? Well, yes, you guessed it. Yes, they're hiding in burrows. So they are hiding underneath the sand. So remember, this area is going to be exposed out of water for a long period of time. And which means that the animals in this environment are going to be exposed to lots of sunlight, so possibly lots of desiccation, lots of drying out, and not that much moisture. So water, and then they are also going to be reliant on not having as much. If they are reliant of being in water, they're not going to have much oxygen availability to them. So if you look in between these kelp, what's dried out, it's been out of water for quite a bit of time. And we usually think that once we see these things washed up on the beach, they are there's lots of things hopping around and flying around them. They're a bit smelly as well, but they actually are a important source of food for some of the animals in this high shore environment. And so it's not obvious when you first look at it, but if you lift one or two of those up, and I don't know if you saw that movement, that slight movement, but that was a little animal hopping around. It's called a sandhopper or an amphipod. Okay, so this is just showing their movement. All those white specks are little animals. And if we were to take a still and a close-up of the animal, this is what it looks like. So it's a sandhopper, it's an amphipod, part of your arthropod group. And so they flatten from side to side, right? And so looking at this particular animal, how do you think it deals with drying out, lots of predation, and yeah, drying out, lots of predation, and being out of water for quite a bit of time? What might they do? Or how are they adapted to this environment?
Do they burrow?
Yes, they do burrow. Okay, look at the color of the animal.
Don't they camouflage in with the soil?
A little bit. You're quite right. They do camouflage a bit with the sand or the soil. So why do they burrow? There's two reasons.
To get to more water in the water bed below the sand.
Possibility, yeah. When are they going to experience most desiccation? In other words, when does the sun shine?
Where the water isn't.
Well, during the day, right? So they are nocturnal. So they usually are hiding in the sand, and they come out in their numbers at night. So if we were to do the similar kind of activity at night, the amount of sandhoppers that we would encounter would multiply. So as I said, they're nocturnal, they hide underneath the sand. And in fact, they are air breathing. They prefer being out of water. So they don't mind that it's a bit dry. They do mind losing the little bit of moisture that they have. And also being preyed on. So they do burrow into the sand and shelter underneath the rotting plants. They usually either emerge at a low tide, and particularly spring low tide is best, really. And as mentioned, are mainly nocturnal. And they are herbivores or scavengers. So they feed on whatever seaweed washes up on the beach. Okay, so here you can see them blending in quite well with the environment and coming out of their little burrows and going back in. Okay, so then as they're feeding, the feces, what they ingest, will filter down into the sediment. And that will then also wash back into the ocean, and that provides an additional source of food for those filter feeders that are found in that environment. Okay, so this was a large number of these amphipods or sandhoppers around a piece of kelp. And within a couple of days, that piece of kelp that washes up on the beach would not be visible. So they are a very, very important source of food for these particular animals. And they're not the only ones that feed on the kelp itself. There are also other species of arthropods, including your isopods. So the difference between amphipods and isopods, amphi means different, so the legs are different, have different functions, hence they're able to hop around as well. Where iso means the same, so the legs are similar in structure, and that's what they use to move around with. And in addition to that, amphipods flatten from side to side, isopods top to bottom. So this is a rather big isopod, usually found along the west coast. It's called the giant pullbug or armadillo. You can see why it's referred to sometimes as an armadillo, because they don't have this hard, one solid exoskeleton. It's kind of in segments. They roll up into sort of like an armadillo. And just as in the case of your amphipods, they are also nocturnal. They do also burrow. Yeah, they do also burrow. And they also consume whatever algae washes up on the beach. And you can see it's using its back limbs to actually dig into the sand. Okay, so that's primarily along the west coast. So you do find some sandhoppers along the east coast as well. And also some species of isopods as well, but it's not the same one that I just pointed out to you now. But along the east coast, there's a rather interesting crab called the ghost crab. You can see the eyes are on these stalks, and they would also hide and shelter into these little rock, sand burrows. So they dig holes up to 1 meter in depth down to the water table. So that helps to keep their gills moist. And as indicated over here, they also have these special tufts of hair at the base of their 2 last legs, and that helps to keep the gills moist. And they emerge at night. So they're also nocturnal. They'll come out at night during low tide, and they'll move up and down the coastline looking for food. And they would feed on anything that is washing up there or living in that environment. So including little isopods, but also small baby hatchling turtles as they hatch and emerge out of the sand where the female might have laid it. This particular ghost crab, this black underneath it, is actually a mass of eggs. So this is a female. So the carapace, or it's not the carapace, sorry, the abdomen fills underneath their body. And with the females, they'll keep all the fertilized eggs, and that's, keep all the fertilized eggs underneath it. So I pointed this out to the team when we went in and recorded, and yes, it looks like just bubbles and things on the water surface or on the sand surface, but actually that is a very important source of food for a lot of small microscopic organisms underneath the sand. So while we don't see any animal other than once we dig into the sand, and we might see some isopods and amphipods there. And there is a multitude of small organisms that forms part of your myofauna that are found in the sand. So for every one bullia, there could be up to about 1,000 of those small microscopic organisms in an area. And they are reliant on whatever is filters back down into the sediment and into the ocean itself. So these are animals that are smaller than 0.5 millimeters in size. And as I said, for every one bullia is the plow snails, there could be up to 15,000 individuals in that particular area. And they, in and of itself, they have their own complex food web. But very, very important in they help break down those organic particles even further so that they are easily colonized by bacteria, and that helps to speed up the decomposition of those organic matter. So just this high shore area, when we look at the ecosystem here, the food web structure, so you have your kelp and various seaweeds washing up on the beach. They are going to be consumed by your isopods and your amphipods. And those in turn are going to be consumed by our national fish, which is the galjoen. And obviously that would only occur at a high tide. So when that area is covered by water, then you'll have some of these fish swimming across that surface and would feed on these organisms, as well as some smaller birds as well. We're now moving into sort of the mid-littoral zone. Okay, so here we're going to have a bit more waves. It's very unstable. So where the high shore was impacted mostly by wind, moving the sand and sediment, so it's always constantly moving. In this instance, the waves are doing exactly the same. So the waves are pushing up that sand and sediment and pushing it up the coastline as well. So it's a very unstable environment and very difficult for organisms to settle within this area. And as mentioned before, there isn't a hard surface, so there isn't going to be that many algae growing in this environment at all. So because this area is mostly covered by water all the time, the water is going to percolate through the sand, so pass through the sand, and so the sand remains damp. And that's rather important for organisms that live in this environment. So one of the important animals that we find in this area are called our plow snails, our finger plow snails. Scientific name is Bullia digitalis. And they burrow in the sand for most of the time. So 94% of its time, it's burrowed in the sand in that mid-intertidal zone or mid-littoral zone. So that helps to save energy. And while they're burrowed in the sand, this part, the structure over here that I'm pointing out to, that is their siphon, and that extends out of the sand and it directs water over the gills of the animal. And along with that water, there'll be chemicals in the water, which indicates that there is a possible animal that has washed up on the beach that has died. And once that happens, the animal then actually goes into full action. It comes out of the water and then moves up the coastline towards where the animal has washed up on the beach. So they, as I said, they have an excellent sense of smell, and that helps to guide them to the food. And that's because of their siphon. So when they're in the sand, so this is, we took one of the animals that had come out onto the beach, onto the higher shore mark, and we turned it upside down to show you what it does once it comes out of the sand. Just to show you the action of the foot. So it comes out comes out of the sand, it goes onto its shell, the foot, which is the part that you saw waving around in the water, that moves or waves in the water, and that kind of like acts like a sail. And so essentially they surf using the waves to get them up to the higher part of the shore. And once they get to the shore, they go back onto their foot and they plow through the sand and move towards the food that has washed up. And so they're scavengers. And so this is a video that was taken by a colleague of mine. And just to show you the amount of plow snails that are moving up. And they are, you can just about see the trails of the animal that it's feeding on. It's a blue bottle. Okay. And because they are not guaranteed food every time, they find the food or get to the food as quickly as possible and latch on, so that when the waves comes in, as you saw in the part of the video, they are still attached to their food. So they don't lose out on that. Okay. And they're similar to whelks in that they've got this radula tooth. And so once they get to the food, they will extend their proboscis, insert the radula tooth to actually digest the food, as similar to what the whelk did. Okay. And again, like with the winkle and the whelk, if it's out of water, it will retract the foot into its shell, and it also has a little bit of a trap door to help seal off that environment so that they don't lose a lot of water, and is also protected. But in addition to that, while they are retracting their foot, they will actually squirt out a bit of water. And I guess that causes a bit of a fright to the animal that is picking it up. So it's another line of defense. So it emerges, it's usually found in your mid-tidal area, and so emerge with a rising tide. So as the tide is moving up towards high tide zone, and so that they can follow the scent of an animal that has washed up on the beach. And as soon as the tide starts receding, so it's going towards low tide, they will move back towards the area that they come from originally. If they don't make it in time, they dig down into the sand, so burrow into the sand, and wait until it's entirely covered by water, and then will recede even further. So as I mentioned earlier on, they're not guaranteed food. So when food is available, they use whatever they can to consume it as quickly as possible. So they can consume up to a third of their body mass, and one meal can hopefully sustain them for 14 days. Because remember, they are reliant on when it is a spring high tide, and when food washes up on the beach. So this is what they feed on. So this is what a live blue bottle in the water. And once these or jellyfish or fish washes up on the beach, as mentioned, the plow snail picks up the scent and then moves up the coastline and feeds on the remains of those animals. The movement that they're creating now, that's them plowing through the sand. It's plow snail. Okay, just to show how they dig down into the sand and then wait for the tide to come in, and then move down further. Okay, so what's the food web like in this particular zone? So any food that washes up on the beach, so that includes your jellyfish, or your sea jellies rather, fish, as well as any other organism, washes up on the beach. The scent is picked up by your plow snails, and they move out of the water up the coastline towards where the food has washed up. And they in turn are going to be eaten by small little birds that come in and out of this environment. So it includes your your seagulls, as well as your sand. Oh, I forgot the name. I'll try and look it up again. Right, the last zone that we look at in terms of this environment is your low tide or low shore zone, or your low littoral fringe. And so this is where the waves are at its sort of strongest. So breaking waves, quite strong. And with that breaking waves, it's creating a lot of turmoil in terms of milling up those sand. So it's moving the sand a lot. Sediment is really unstable, even more so than in your mid-littoral zone. And so there's not really opportunity for organisms really to dig down into this area. There are some that do, but mostly would use other ways of actually residing in that environment. So as with the mid-littoral zone, water also filters down through the sand, and it remains saturated, remain damp. And that's also, again, once important for animals that hide in the sand in this particular area. And one such area, animal is your white mussels, your Donax species. Okay, so they shelter in the sand at low tide mark, and they move up the beach as the tide rises. So as it becomes high tide, they move up towards, but they usually try and remain in the surf zone, so where the waves are breaking. And that's important because these animals are filter feeders. So they are reliant on that turbulence, so that movement of water, because it creates more food source for them in that area. So they filter feeders. They filter on microscopic organic material that is deposited by the rising waves. They breathe through their gills, as do most bivalves. And as mentioned, they return to the low tide mark with the receding tide. So as the tide moves towards low tide, they also sort of migrate up or down the shore. So what the animal looks like, so this is one that was defrosted. So they've got two openings, two siphons, one through which they'll take water in that passes over their gills, so to filter and extract oxygen, but also food. And then the wastewater, which has now more carbon dioxide and also whatever they can't consume, that will be egested through the other siphon. They also have this big muscular foot, and this is what they use to dig down into the sand, into the sediment. So they'll dig down into the sediment with that foot. They'll open up their shell a little bit, so to create a bit of a wedge, and then dig down even further, and in doing so, they'll pull down their shell even more. But just deep enough so that their siphons can reach the surface. So it will be extended out of the sediment, and that is often the only two parts that you get to see if you were to see them in the water itself. So as I was trying to explain, when we do go out in a collection for white mussels, and it's usually for food for some of the animals in the aquarium, we have to do a bit of a jig, a bit of a twist. And so if you feel any hard surface with your toes, then you dig down very, very quickly to try and catch the mussels before they dig even further down, and hope and pray that it isn't a crab that your toes are feeling. So this is a video just to show you how effective clams and mussels are in terms of filtering the surrounding water. So the one tank has no mussels or no clams in it, and the other has clams. And you can just see how clear the water becomes after a couple of minutes. So they're very effective in terms of filtering the surrounding water. Okay, so once again, the sandy shore food web here. So your mussels digging down into that area of the littoral zone. They are consumed by either white steenbras when it comes over that environment at a high tide, or when it is a little bit more exposed, still underwater because they're never out of water entirely, but you'll have these gulls coming into that environment, diving into that environment and pulling those mussels out. And then they, as you saw in the previous video with the rocky shore, they'll fly up into the air, drop the mussel down on a hard surface to crack it open, and then dive down to actually consume the soft body parts. The other little animal that comes into this environment is this small little bird. And they go and look for the siphon. So as they see the siphon sort of appearing out of the sand, they will nip on it. So they don't really consume the entire animal. They just basically nip on the siphons as it goes along. Okay, so beyond where the sort of the high tide and the low tide would reach at spring low tide and spring high tide, there's that area that's always underwater. And so similarly to the low tide or low shore zone, you also have experience very strong waves, and sediment is really, really unstable. And so very few species are actually capable of living here. So two of the species that you would find in this environment are your mysids. They are rather versatile. They move, you'll see that they're rather transparent, so they blend in very well within this environment. They can either swim and or burrow, and even their feeding habits might be quite diverse. So they filter and scoop up any organic particles that are in the water using their feet. And on the right-hand side, that's a swimming crab. So they would also be found within this environment, and they'll come out feeding on various other organisms. So this is some mysids in the aquarium. So just to show you their swimming behavior and swarming behavior. And as they're moving through the water, they are filtering the water for any organic particles suspended in that environment. So because they're living in an environment where there's lots of turbulence, lots of wave action, they actually go with the movement of the water as well. So while we might see this environment as being rather barren, not much life, there is actually a very, very complex ecosystem occurring here. And even the kelp that washes up on the beach, or the dead animals that wash up on the beach, those blue bottles, etc., they actually still form part of this ecosystem. So once again, the kelp washing up on the beach, they're consumed by your isopods and your amphipods. In your midshore, you've got your plow snails, and they in turn are going to be consumed by they're consumed by your galjoen, our national fish that comes into this area, but also some seagulls. And then your white mussels that are found in your low shore environment, they're going to be consumed by seagulls as well as white steenbras when they come over that environment. And that concludes the session. And I believe you have lots of questions.
Hi, I just want to hear, how does the different textures of, say, fine sand and coarse sand affect the burrowing of the animals, and do they have specific adaptations to adjust to the different textures?
Okay, thank you for mentioning that. I forgot to mention that because of that differences in textures of the sediment, so very, very coarse sand or very fine sand. So animals, organisms would generally prefer to be in a sort of a mixture of the two. So they don't like too coarse sand and they don't like too fine sand. They prefer to be found in an environment where there's sort of a bit of a balance between the two. So
Okay,
thank you for that question.
Of course, thank you very much.
Anything else?
Hi, I just want to ask, on the sandy beaches, are there then far more carnivores or scavengers compared to the herbivores, seen as they are only the kelp that can help the herbivores?
Well, remember they're different areas, different areas of that coastline. So you do have some scavengers. So those are your plow snails that are coming up on the beach once anything has died and washes up on the beach or dying, busy decomposing. So they would be your scavengers, including your crabs. Your crabs would also be scavengers mostly. And then a lot of filter feeders in the mid littoral zone as well as the low littoral zone as well. And then high up on the coastline, a combination of scavengers and herbivores.
And then can I just hear, because compared to the rocky shores, there's a lot less diversity. Are there any invasive species that pose a threat to the sandy shores?
Good question. It actually is over both of the ecosystems, the rocky shore as well as the sandy shore. So what we have seen here along our west coast and south coast is in the rocky shore, it's the black mussels, the Mediterranean mussels that have come into those areas. But while they are invasive alien species, they actually have opened up a niche for and food source for our oyster catchers. So in that instance, it's a good thing. They are actually still providing food for other organisms. But one that is creating a bit of problem, and that is the green crab, the green Mediterranean crab, that is covered. It's coming into the rocky shore environment as well as the sandy shore environment. In the rocky shore environment, more so, they're out competing the other animals within that same environment. Not so much, to my knowledge, in terms of the sandy shore.
I also just have a question. Do you perhaps know which of these species could be considered like a keystone species on the sandy shores?
So the keystone within each of those environments, the ones that are pointed out are the keystone species. So on the high shore, it's the amphipods and the isopods. In your mid littoral zone, it's those finger plow snails, and your white mussels in your lower littoral zone. So they're not quite what we call, you kind of like the most abundant of the organisms that we find there, as in that we would name that zone after the presence of that particular organism, but they are rather important within those ecosystems.
Thank
Not
you.
sure if I've answered it.
Yes, thank you.
And then one last question from me. Are there human activities that have disrupted the sandy shores enough that it requires conservation efforts?
More so in terms of your sort of high shore zone and your dune systems, where we have the kelp that have been removed, and so you having not as much food source available for those organisms, which obviously once that's decomposed, that filters back into the sand and into the ocean and provide another source of food for your filter feeders like your mysids and your white mussels. But more in terms of the dune system, where we've disrupted the dune system, where we have taken out a lot of the vegetation, or we've walked over the vegetation, and so as a result of that, you have the movement of that sand, because of the wind, will actually cover over a number of infrastructure. So what we often experience here in Cape Town, in an area called Standfontein, is that the roads that passes past the sandy beaches are often covered by sand. And that was because we basically had a road between what was essentially a dune system. And so because of that, there was nothing still to control or keep the sand in place on the beach side. And so the sand would blow over into the road and it becomes a bit of an obstruction. So that's one of the ways to kind of counter that, is where they've kept the kelp in those environments. They haven't removed the kelp from the beaches. And so, as I explained earlier on, to ensure that it traps the sand to start that dune system all over again. And that has helped reduce the amount of sand covering out over the beaches in certain time periods. There are also in some areas of the sandy beach ecosystems, particularly sandy dune areas, where they've created these boardwalks. The boardwalks is just above the plants. The terrestrial plants are still growing underneath it. So it still keeps the sand in place and reduces erosion, but it does allow for a passage for people to get onto the beach. So there are things being put into place to sort of counter those particular issues.
One last question from my side as well. Are there any organisms that frequently move between rocky shores and sandy shores?
So the ones that are a bit more mobile, I guess. So it would be fish. So you might find some similar species of fish over the sandy shore, as well as either rocky shores rather close by. The other, as we were pointing out, we've got kelp. They do generally prefer a hard substrate. So we have kelp in your rocky shore environment, and some offshore kelp forests as well. Let me think of others. We have also seen on occasion some cuttlefish. So we know that the cuttlefish are also found within the sandy shore environment. And the reason we know that, because the cuttle bone washes up on the beach. So that's the internal shell that washes up on the beach. But when we have explored rocky shores at night, we have also seen some cuttlefish in that environment as well. So there are one or two species, but it's generally ones that are a little bit more mobile.
I just quickly wanted to mention, well, the first day that we went down onto the beach there, Treasure Beach, I know last year, the pollution, the plastic pollution was very bad, but this year it was enormously depressing. There is so much plastic on that beach. Yeah, it's because Treasure Beach is situated just next to or behind, or I don't know what you would want to say, but next to areas where people live along the rivers. There's Mondial paper mills that are, next door. It's next to the harbor. So it's just, I don't know. It's just very depressing. That first day it was really, really, it's like sad because we're never going to be able to get rid of all that. And there's of everything. And if I think the students could have done a study on the number of plastic lids of bottles. There are, I don't know, just, yes, there's of everything, everything and anything there. And you can already see that the particles are breaking down. There's small little microplastic particles lying already on the shore. So yeah, it's very sad.
Okay, so Savannah posted something about the turtles. I don't know whether she's still in the audience. So yes, so we have received a lot of hatchling turtles that have washed up along the coastline. So the loggerhead turtles primarily, and we had 1 or 2 leatherback turtles as well. They hatch off the coastline of KZN. So again, that's a sandy shore environment. So the adult female turtle will go on shore, lay eggs in various batches. And then usually around this time, so March, February, March, they hatch out of their burrows and make their way into the Agulhas stream. When they get closer and closer to the south coast, and obviously after a big storm like we've experienced here in Cape Town, within a couple of days, a lot of them had been washed up onto the beach. So we were getting calls from Struisbaai, from Agulhas, from Plettenberg Bay, all around the south coast, as well as a little bit up the west coast, of people finding turtles that have washed up on the beach. So we have up to at the count at the moment is we've got 500 baby hatchlings that we're looking after at the moment. So these are additional 500 mouths that we didn't expect to feed. So we are reliant on donations from members of public as well as businesses to help us with that. Of that 500, we've sent 100 up to Ushaka. They had their own seats in the plane. And not to Ushaka, they had their own seats in the plane, but they went to Bayworld in Port Elizabeth. And so the aquarists there are continuing the rehabilitation with those animals, and they'll release them off that coastline. And so they'll stay in our care for another 3 to 4 months until they're a little bit bigger and much more healthier. And then we will release them back into the ocean. And usually what we then do is, so that they get back into the Agulhas stream, we go off Cape Point, a couple of nautical miles off Cape Point, until we reach the Agulhas stream, Agulhas current stream. So the water temperature is a bit warmer at that point, and we release them back into the ocean. Yeah. So yeah, she was saying also many people asked about the barnacles that are attached to the sea turtles. Are they harmful to them? And what is the species? Okay, so the species of barnacles that are covering the turtles are mainly goose barnacles. So they are usually attach themselves onto anything that is floating around in the water. So it includes turtles, bottles, plastic, whatever floating around in the water. They attach onto that hard surface. And they also filter feeders, as in the case of the barnacles that we saw on the rocky shore as well. As far as I know, they're not harmful to the animal. We do, however, choose to remove them as quickly as possible. So we put them in a freshwater bath to kill off the barnacles and whatever other organisms have settled onto the animal. And we remove them as best as possible off the surface of the animal. And that is because when we do release them, those barnacles are going to actually cause a bit of a drag as they're moving through the water column. So it reduces the movement of the animal. So we wanting to remove that as best as possible. Okay, so we had 3 leatherback turtles, and we've just released that back into the environment because they don't do well in captivity. So we release those as soon as possible.
Okay, may I
And
speak?
that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bianca. I also just want to share different talks that we did with the Two Oceans Aquarium about 2 years ago. And that was with Talita Noble, and that was with turtles. So I'm sharing that with Marit's name, and that is in the chat now. I want to ask a question regarding the whole, this is now not rocky shores and sandy beaches, but I think both Professor and Dr. Candice will also be keen to know, do you do any parasitology work at Two Oceans Aquarium?
So we have usually have quite a number of students that do research at the aquarium. So they use us as a basis. So one of the students, about a year or so ago, she was particularly looking at the biota, so the variety of animals, organisms that attach onto turtles. And so she was looking at what percentage of the turtles is covered as they come in, and what percentage of that is barnacles or algae that covers their surface. On one occasion, we actually found marine leeches, and I never knew that they were marine leeches, but they apparently are. And so on one turtle, they were covered with marine leeches, variety of bryozoa and hydroids as well. Pardon me. So we've looked at studies of that. I don't know what has happened to her research around that. And then prior to that, not just specifically in relation to the turtles, but more in relation to the fish species that we have, we've looked at parasitology. So we have looked at the parasites that affect the animals, particularly either external parasites or parasites that cover the gills, or internal parasites. So we've looked at that. And to the point that my colleague, he's since left and is now in Australia, he got to name 1 or 2 of these parasites because it was new to science. Yeah, so he got to name them.
Thank you so much, Bianca. I'm going to just open the floor if there are any more questions. So, Dr. Candy.
So what I will do, Aisha, if you don't mind, I'm going to share our Give and Gain campaign to help us raise funds for the hatchling turtles. If you can in turn share it with the audience, and that can just help us to tide them over until we release them back into the ocean.
That will be great. Is it a link, or do you want to share screen?
Yes, it is a link, yes.
Okay, we'll do that. Oh, Mr. Johan Kruger.
Hi, Aisha.
Johan.
Bianca, I would like to ask if a student is excited about a possible career in marine conservation, what would be a good way for them to step into that career, and how did you start?
So my journey has been very lots of turns and yeah, lots of passages. So I am a marine educator, so not so much in terms of the actual physical conservation of the animals or the research aspect. I'm an educator, so I teach at the aquarium. We teach school groups from grade 1 through to grade 12, and on the odd occasion, university students and Technikon students as well. So I started out at the aquarium as a volunteer. When the aquarium opened in 1995, I was one of the first intake of volunteers. My background is science, so I have a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology, so I do have a background in this particular ecosystem. But in addition to that, I had also done my teacher training, so my high diploma in education as well. And I taught at a school prior to working at the aquarium. So I volunteered at the aquarium for 3 years, and then got the opportunity to work at the aquarium and essentially worked my way up to the position I'm in right now. So being prepared, from my perspective, I think being prepared to volunteer in a number of different organizations, because you gain so much from that. Not just only in terms of sort of job exposure. In our setting, because our aquarium is so small, we get to do everything. So I have cleaned tanks, I have gone diving and collecting animals along with our staff. I have done talks in a variety of places, etc. So I've had opportunities to do a number of things because of our aquarium being so small. And that has obviously just enriched my ability to answer questions in a number of different fields. So I think from my perspective, yes, the qualifications are important, but the practical experience is just as important. And you gain those practical experiences from volunteering and doing internship at organizations like ourselves.
Thanks, Bianca. We have huge respect for the hard yards that you put in, and it shows in your just expansive knowledge of the subject. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. And maybe we can do focused animal groups. So we can do just something just on mollusks or just on echinoderms, because we have all of the specimens here. And thank you very much.
Bianca, are we going to hold you to that? No, we got that recorded. So just saying. I just on a follow-up from what Johan asked, I know that WWF has an internship and the NRF has an internship in which Two Oceans Aquarium hold interns, well, via the Two Oceans Aquarium. Does the Two Oceans Aquarium offer any internships?
So we have directly with CPUT, we've got a relationship. So the Cape Peninsula University, Technikon. Sorry, I don't know what the acronym is. So we've got a relationship with the lecturers at CPUT, and so their final year, they 1 or 2 of them are selected to do internship at the aquarium. Over and above that, we do often get requests from other universities as well to do internship. Most of our internship is usually internationals. So students from other parts of the world that wants to do a bit of practical experience here. So we have, at the moment, we've got a student from Italy doing some research here. And then we also, as I said, we've got a lot of local interns as well. We only recently started our own research department as well. So where it's not just we doing research on behalf of other organizations, we're now doing our own research and creating our own research papers as well.
Okay, and then also on that, when we were here about 2-3 weeks ago, that's the first time I learned that you can volunteer, like not, how do I say, a semi-permanent volunteer, where you can come in and volunteer just for a few hours on a day. So could you maybe just tell us more about the volunteering process, please?
Okay, so volunteering. So we have two ways in which people can become volunteers at the aquarium. So we have volunteers that had started out with us when they were in grade 10. We've got what we call the Young Biologist course. We select students it was initially just from Cape Town, then it became the Western Cape, and then all over the country. So we've had students flying down from Johannesburg, from Bloemfontein, from Port Elizabeth, and from Durban to be part of our volunteer program. It's essentially a 6-week program, which we take you through the variety of seaweeds and invertebrates that we have along our coastline. And initially, the volunteers start off sharing information at the touch pool and the microscope. And they've got to volunteer in that space for 45 hours. The requirement of our volunteers is that they submit to at least 1 4-hour shift per month. That's really not a lot. So usually our volunteers finish those 45 hours very, very quickly. And then after volunteering front of house, they then have the opportunity to go into behind the scenes. And back behind the scenes is where you get to help prepare the food for the different animals in the aquarium. So cut up fish, squid, etc. You also get to feed some of the displays along with our aquarist. And once you are trained how to clean and siphon. And on the odd occasion, if you're lucky, and you're here at the time when we are doing collections, you get to go on a collection trip as well. So I said we've got volunteers from grade 10, and then we also have volunteers from 18 years up that sign up to do our volunteer course. So we usually have it around September, October. And we take you through all of the content, irrespective of what your background is. We assume that you know nothing. And we take you through all the content and prepare you to interact with our members of public initially, and eventually to help behind the scenes as well. So just to give an idea for our grade 10s, our Young Biologist course, we've been running it now for 20 odd years. Some of the students that have done our course are now doctors in botany and marine biology that have gone into the field. Others have gone into teaching, others have gone into other spheres. So we've got a large group of students that had started out their initial passage into science with us. Which we're very proud of.
So
okay.
we will share the link. We'll share it with you, Dr. Andy, to please share with the students and the University of the Free State. And I just need to say thank you for a phenomenal talk today. Both talks were phenomenal. It was extremely well done. We can see, like you answered, the way you speak, the passion in it. And I'm just going to tell the students as well, during the break, Bianca only had half a break because she was still speaking to us here and telling us more about the animals. So her passion went into the break time as well. And not just for today. I mean, we were really on your case for, I think, 2 months now in prep for this. We appreciate all of it. I'm saying that on the behalf of ShareScreen Africa and the team. So thank you so much, Bianca.
I just also like to thank Bianca. It was really nice to see, I think for the students also to see some of the organisms in action. So yes, thank you so much for giving up your whole afternoon for us. And to Maret and Aisha also for organizing it. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.